actually learned a little bit in the last couple of days from questions that people have asked me. So I have some of that in here as well. And we can stop anytime and have questions and discuss things. So actually, these are old screenshots from the previous presentation, but I left them in there because they look kind of neat. So there's some, just to start out with, some very basic reasons for the range reduction in the winter. And that's really all we're talking about is range reduction in the winter. And starting with the cold battery is the biggest one, where the car's been sitting all night and it's really, really cold. And you get in and the car has to expend a lot of energy, not just to heat the cabin, but to heat the battery as well. So even after it's heated the battery, it's still not as efficient as it is during the summer because it's continuously have to fight the cold. Because unlike a gasoline powered car that has lots of heat that wants to escape it, an EV doesn't. So it has to generate its own heat for both the cabin and the battery. Low tire pressure is another big one that isn't as obvious. And you get, the tire pressure goes down as the weather gets colder, and the EV becomes less efficient because with lower tire pressure, you have more resistance driving down the road. So it's always good to, about this time of year, check the tires, and then in another month, check them again. You can just do that on the screen to see what your tire pressure is and see if you need to top up. And then the third one is the least obvious, and that is multiple stops without plugging in. And what I mean by that is if you get in the car in the morning and you drive 30 minutes down the road and you park somewhere for 2 hours and do whatever, and then you get, and it's bitterly cold out, say it's below freezing, and you get back in the car and you drive another 20 minutes somewhere else and you park again for another 2 hours, and you get back in the car and you drive again, those stops over those 2 hours, the battery loses a lot of the heat that it had in it, that it heated itself, it generates, there's a heater that generates heat and it heats up the battery. And as it loses that heat over those 2 hours, it then has to expend a lot more energy to heat itself back up, as well as the cabin. So multiple stops where you're stopping for 1 or 2 hours at a time over the day, you end up, you can lose half your range just because of those multiple stops and the fact that it's cold. So that's just something to be aware of. And when you first start out in the mornings or after it's been sitting in a parking lot for a while for a stop, you have reduced brake regeneration. And over these last, not the last couple of days now, but over the past week, you probably have seen that. And you may have seen the snowflake, depending on whether or not you park outside. The snowflake, let me turn on annotation, I'm gonna need that. And so let's see if this works. Oh yeah, the snowflake indicates that the battery is cold enough that you are not, you're having reduced range because there's a portion of the battery, essentially there's a percentage of the battery that can't be used, it's so cold. And as you drive, the car will heat the battery, and the use of the battery by driving, the current being pulled out of it will heat the battery, and that snowflake should go away. Now, if it's really, really cold, it's down in the teens or in the single digits, the snowflake may just stay there while you're driving for quite a while. And over here, you'll see, and it's not that important, but if you look closely on the screen, the dots on the left side indicate the amount of regen that is not there. So when you're driving, the little line goes in this direction whenever you're regenning, and it goes in the other direction when you're accelerating. So as you slow down and it goes this way, it can only go this far. And when it's really cold, that dotted line will be all the way back here. So it can like regen this much. So you don't get much braking, that braking feeling when you let off the accelerator, because it's protecting the battery by not letting it regen too much. And the reason for that is that a cold battery can't accept current in. It can put out current, it can't put out as much current as when it's warm, but in particular, it can't accept current in, and that can damage the battery. So the car is very intelligent, and it limits how much current can go into the battery. So when you take your foot off the accelerator and it's very, very cold, that dotted line all the way back will prevent any, it's just a display of what is preventing from going into the battery. Now, as you drive, and if it's kind of neat to watch, you'll start out on a cold morning and you'll see the dots, they go all the way back close to the center. As you drive, you'll see one dot disappear and one dot disappear. And very slowly those dots disappear. And that's the process of your battery warming up. And when all the dots are gone, then you have full regen. So this was actually, I think 3 days ago, I took this picture. So it was cold enough to lose partial regen. And you get a message on the screen too when you start up saying that you have reduced braking, or not reduced braking, but reduced regenerative braking. Advance.
So if it's not regenerating when you let off the accelerator, is it using the friction brakes, or how did?
Yeah, you would. So I mean, if you're used to rolling up to a stop sign, having the car roll to a stop, the regenerative braking is what's slowing you down to roll to a stop. So when the car is very cold, you have to take your foot and put it on the actual physical brake and stop the car. So it's something that may be a little surprising for someone that's been driving an EV for just the summer. You know, they started driving during the summer, and then all of a sudden it gets cold, and all of a sudden it feels like the car is not stopping because the regen is not pulling it back because the battery can't take the current. So you actually have to be aware that you have to step on the brake.
So yeah, because I've gotten the message that regenerative braking has been reduced, but I haven't noticed any effect to the car slowing down properly as I let off the accelerator. So
well, when it's really cold, then you'll start noticing it.
Yeah,
okay.
It will. And even after the dots all disappear, like you were talking about, Zeb, I've noticed that the cars still will not, or at least what my Model S's, won't slow down or decelerate at the same rate as they do if the battery is really toasty warm. It's better. I mean, you know, like when it's cold soaked, you get absolutely no deceleration or virtually no deceleration. But even once the battery, the dots are gone, it can still be a good, half hour of additional driving before you get that the full hit of if you let your foot off the accelerator.
That's interesting. I hadn't noticed that, but I guess that means there's some hidden dots over here.
This is the same phenomenon if you do charge your car to 100% for a road trip. That first, 10% you're gonna have the same like the first time I did that, I was driving out of the neighborhood and almost ran a stop sign because the car didn't come to a stop.
It's the same thing. It's the car protecting the battery by preventing the charge from going into it. So, of course, what you can do to help mitigate this is preheat the car in the morning before you leave, or you can use scheduled departure. I've never used scheduled departure because I don't leave at a consistent time. So I always just pull up the app on the phone and hit the preheat, which is just hitting the little on the climate control, or little fan icon on the main screen, which we'll see in the next on the main screen of the app, which we'll see in the next image. And the app has changed quite a bit on how it indicates what is happening in the car. I didn't even realize this until I was playing around with it just a couple days ago. But now, on the main screen, you can see all the information. So when you get the little, let me change a little, there. So you get the little snowflake icon showing that the battery is very cold, and down here on the charge screen, you'll see a little blue area, and that's basically indicating how much of the battery you can't use because it's just too cold. So if you hit the little fan here to start the preconditioning, where it heats up the cabin of the car, it's also heating the battery, and it indicates it in two places. It indicates it with the little bacon strips up here on the battery, and it shows that it's heating the car by showing the defrost and whatnot. But it also changes the line, which I didn't realize until just a couple days ago, from green to an orange color. And then when it's done preheating, it changes back to a green line. And the line and the bacon goes away from the battery up here. But this is a little bit different because it was actually started charging when I took this screenshot. But it wouldn't have that little charge thing there if you were just preheating. But the line goes from green to an orange when it's heating the battery, and then it switches to green. Now the cabin you might get the message saying the cabin has reached your desired temperature. You get that little push notification on your phone. That doesn't mean it's done heating the battery. That just means it's done heating the cabin. But if you open the app and you don't see the little bacon strips or the orange color for the line for the battery, then it is done heating the battery.
How
So
long,
if you,
how long will the preheat last after it's done?
oh, that's a good question. If you preheated it and then just didn't drive the car for a couple of hours, I don't think it goes back and keeps heating the battery. So actually, I don't know. Maybe it does. As long as you have the preheat turned on, it might keep re-warming the battery as it cools down. I'm gonna have to test that to see what happens. I don't know. But as far as how long will it hold the heat in the battery if you just turn off preconditioning or turn off the heat, I don't know. I mean, it's gonna start losing it immediately. So it's just how cold it is outside. I know if you leave the car sit in a parking lot for 2 hours in 15-degree weather, it will lose enough heat that it will have to turn the heater back on for the battery. So
Okay,
you just try and heat it up before you leave. And something else I noticed completely unrelated, well, not completely unrelated, and I don't quite understand this. Here, wherever you set the little slider to on the charge, like mine's set to 80%, it gives you what the battery will be at 80%, 231 miles. But then after it was warmed up, it showed that the 80% charge was going to be 241 miles, which I've never seen that change before like that. So that was kind of interesting. I had to play around with that some more. I don't know if that 231 miles may be thinking or maybe calculated based on this little blue area of unusable battery. I guess that's possible. But it's not really that relevant. It's just something interesting I noticed. So basically you see the blue snowflake, you hit the fan, and it can take up to 45 minutes to warm the battery, depending on how cold it is. And the little strips show it's warming, and then when everything turns green, that means the battery's done warming. It doesn't have to wait for the battery to be done warming, but if you want to know when it's done warming, you could just look at the app. Oh, I got to turn off annotation to be able to continue.
Hi, I've heard 3 values discussed so far.
Yes.
Too cold, cold, and warm. Can we throw some numbers on that?
When you say too cold, cold, and warm, for this screen, what are we talking about?
Well, just in general, we've talked cold. Would
Mhm.
that be like below 50, below 40, below 30?
Oh, just in general, it's a sliding scale
Yeah.
because it's the colder it is, the more impact it has. So when it is down, I'd say when it's down below 40 degrees, you're going to start noticing a difference. And when it's down below 20 degrees, you're going to notice a big difference. I don't know what other people's opinions are, but it's really not, there's not a set number. This was when it was below freezing, but it wasn't terribly cold. So if it were down at say 15 degrees or 10 degrees, this blue area would be a lot bigger. It would take longer to heat the battery. And then driving around and stopping the car, it would lose heat a lot faster. So it's, I don't know that there's a set chart that I can find to show that you'd lose 10% at this temperature and 15% at this temperature type thing. But the colder it is, the more impactful it will be.
And it's impacting not only range, but it's also impacting, as we were saying earlier, the ability for regen to occur and the braking. So if you're used to 1 foot driving, that changes probably about 50, I would say. You start to get the regen impact, but the closer you get to actual freezing, it becomes more pronounced.
Yeah, and there's one more thing that it impacts, and that's the other thing I'm going to talk about, which is charging, specifically when you're traveling. Because if you try to charge a cold battery when you're traveling, it's on a supercharger, it takes quite a while. So obviously the first thing when traveling is to try and charge while the battery is warm. And once you start traveling, if you're traveling where you have multiple supercharger stops, as long as you don't park somewhere for a long period of time and you charge up the car, you hit the supercharger and you do it before you park anywhere, then you should be fine. But if you park overnight and I'll get to that one. Yeah, if you park overnight and get up the next morning and it's down in the teens and whatnot, and you drive straight to a supercharger and plug in, it's going to take you a long time to charge because it's got to spend the first 30-40 minutes heating the battery to the point that it can take a higher current, because it can't take high current at all when the battery is cold. So it'll just sit there and just trickle charge while it's heating the battery until it gets warm enough that it could start taking more charge, and that can take quite a while. So it's best to charge before you stop for the night. And the other thing is to always use navigation when going to a supercharger, because it adds extra heat to the battery. It does a preheating, an extra warm-up method, or an extra warm-up process to the battery while you're traveling to the supercharger to get it hot enough to take a much higher current. So always using navigation gets you the best charge rate when you get to the supercharger. And then I sort of just said this is when you get to your destination. I made this mistake early on. It was below freezing, and I drove to Boone years ago, and drove there, and I had like 10% battery left, and I was tired. And we're staying at a hotel that was right across the street from the supercharger. I mean, not Boone. We went to Asheville. Boone doesn't have a supercharger, unfortunately. But got there, spent the night, and got up the next morning and figured, I'm just going to get up and charge the car. And I drove over to the supercharger, and it was charging at like 10 kilowatt. That's the most it would charge at for the first 30 minutes. And then it slowly crept up from there. So it ended up taking me like an hour and a half, maybe even close to an hour and 45 minutes to charge up the car, when, if I had charged on the way in and stopped there while the battery is warm, it would have taken 30 minutes. Oh, and if you're plugged into a charger overnight, if the hotel has destination charging, then you can preheat in the morning. You can also preheat in the morning if you don't have destination charging and you know how far it is to the supercharger. That's fine as well. But if you're plugged in, it's great. I mean, it's just for the most part, it's using the charger to heat the battery and heat the cabin.
So, question about that charging overnight there then, like if so, I'm planning, we're going up to Pennsylvania to see family for the holiday, and I'll be doing multiple superchargers along the way. So based on what you said, I don't think I'll be too concerned. It'll just be driving from one to the next. So charging should be okay because the car is so warm. When I get to my mother-in-law's, there's a supercharger near her. So my plan, I guess, will be to take the car up, get it charged up, come back to her house, and then plug it in right away with the standard charger. Will just off of the mobile charger, will it still charge when it's parked outside? And, will it keep the battery warm enough to charge it up?
Yes. If you're plugged into a standard outlet?
Yeah, just like,
okay.
Yeah.
I have a good example for this. I plugged in overnight in Boone behind a hotel to a standard outlet, and it was down probably 18, 15 degrees. And it does charge, but it will cycle the battery. The method, it depends on the car, but the method it used to heat the battery heater, essentially, it will cycle that on and off while it's charging, because the current coming in isn't quite enough, to keep the battery warm just from the charging. So it actually has to add heat to the battery. So I'd watch the app, and I would see it would be charging at 4 miles per hour, and then pull up the app 10 minutes later, and I see it's charging at 0 miles per hour, but it's still using the current. It's because it was heating the battery. So in the bitter cold, if you were trying to plug it into a regular outlet, and you'd expect to get maybe 40 miles overnight or something like that, or maybe not even that much. No, I guess you could get that. You could get 40 miles overnight. Maybe you'd get 15 or 20 miles overnight. it may be significantly less because it has to keep cycling on the battery management system to keep the battery warm so it can accept the charge.
Okay.
So the one thing that it's not a big deal, but it's just something to be aware of. The navigation, when it does its initial calculation, it uses the temperature outside the car. And I actually had another member contact me about a scenario they ran into where they got into the car in the garage. They navigated while the car was in the garage, and then they drove out of the garage and went on their merry way. But the navigation was based on the 60 degrees inside the garage, but it was 25 degrees outside. So that made the navigation, it threw the navigation off. And the percent that it was showing was, as he drove through the cold for a while, then it started showing, the opposite, it started dropping, and its initial estimate for the destination was not right, and he wouldn't have been able to get there without stopping at a supercharger. So it's just something to be aware of, that when it does the initial calculation for navigation, it does it based on the temperature that the external temperature sensor in the car is reading, because it does take the temperature into account. But it's, if you're in a garage, that can throw it off. And the other thing is, and this is very handy, and a lot of people don't even know that it has a round trip estimate. If you just scroll up on that list for navigation, at the bottom, there's a round trip estimate, which is what percent the battery will have in it when you get back to your, so if you're at a supercharger and you're going to a destination and you want to come back to that supercharger, it's real handy. I use it going to the beach all the time. So that if you leave the supercharger and you go to your destination, you do something at the destination, you turn around, you come back to the supercharger, that's the percent you'll have when you get back to it. Or it could be just leaving home. I'm leaving home and I'm going to a destination. And when I get back from my destination, this is how much I'll have left. And it gives you the idea that, or it gives you, the knowledge that you will be able to get back to your house or to a supercharger with a certain percent battery. However, in the bitter cold, that round trip estimate can also be thrown off, because if you park overnight and expect to come back to that supercharger, it's going to be less than what it's estimating, because it has to heat the battery up in the morning when you leave, and that's going to use quite a bit of power. So say it's showing that the battery will have 15% in it when you get back to the supercharger, after you've driven from the supercharger to a hotel somewhere, spent the night, and then come back to the supercharger. Maybe that 15% is actually 5% or 3%. So it could be quite a bit different. So it's just something not to rely on when it's really, really cold. Now, if you're just driving somewhere in the cold, going there to pick something up and turning around and coming back to the supercharger, it should be fine. It should be pretty accurate, because all of that is based on the current temperature outside the car. And there's one other bit on here, which is the trip screen, the energy screen for trips, which is that it's using the same percent that it calculates in the navigation. This is the navigation percent. So it falls under the same caveat of, if you're in a garage, it could be off. But it is just something that's really, I love this screen, just to be able to look at it while I'm driving and see how I'm doing. Because when you first navigate, the colored line is right on top of, that is the estimation. And then as you drive, the colored line starts diverging. And this is a screenshot that someone else sent me. I didn't have one handy, so it's a little blurry. But as you drive, that colored line moves based on, how much energy you're using. So the gray line underneath it, that was the original estimate. And then as you're driving, the line will either move up or move down, above or below the gray line. So if it moves below the gray line, you're using more power than the car thought you were going to use. If it moves above the gray line, you're using less power than the car thought you were going to use. So it's something really neat and nice to look at during a trip, to know that you're using less or more power than what the car has estimated for navigation. So it could be very handy with trips. And it changes based on temperature as you're driving, where the navigation, the original plotting of the navigation, is based on the temperature when you leave. So that's another interesting thing just to watch. And this is all plotted out, and I'll go to the previous one real quick. This is a plot to Boone, North Carolina. So driving along, it's pretty consistent because the elevation doesn't change. It takes elevation into account as well. But this is that climb into Boone where it dips down. So when it's dipping down, that means it's using more power. That last little bit to get into Boone is the climb. So it's neat to look at some of these things. So that's all the information that I had, but I'm sure there's more information you need. So what other questions do you have?
Well, I had a question about the, in the main display, when you see the kilowatts used for your trip, you know, and how many kilowatts per mile
Mhm.
for the trip, does that count the amount of energy used for heating the batteries and that as well as the drive, or is that separate?
It
No, is that the total consumption or is that just for propelling the car?
It is the total consumption, but only while you're moving. So it doesn't count the energy while the car is parked. So if you park the car and you're preheating the battery, that's not really accounted for anywhere. But as
Okay.
soon as you put the car in drive, then that accounts. I mean, that number, that watt hours per mile, accounts for all the energy that's being used, including heating the battery and heating the cabin.
Okay, yeah, because I was watching that in the colder weather and I was thinking
Okay.
that it looked too good. Yeah,
Oh, it looked too good. Okay.
which is
Well,
good. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, it'll look okay if you start out with a warm battery. So if your battery's already warm when you start out, then it'll look pretty good. But then if you park the car for 3 hours in 13-degree weather or something like that, and then get back in it, it's going to look
Yeah.
pretty bad for a little bit while it's warming the battery back up.
Yeah, my car
Yeah, so-
lives out. My car lives outdoors, so I'm gonna start whenever I start off. I got a cold battery, but I like the preheating. It heats the cabin up remarkably fast.
Oh yeah, it does, especially on the newer the. Actually, no, I even did it on my old early 2018 one.
Yeah, my
It does heat up
2016
really
S
fast.
heats real fast also. And yeah, I was just chuckling there. Somebody had posted on Facebook the other day on one of the Facebook groups that they were showing and asking about the dotted line and they didn't understand it. So people were explaining that. And I observed that the gal had been previously burning 530 watt hours per mile, per mile or over the last 30 minutes. And it was like, that's just an absurdly high number, but you know, she was obviously in a very cold area. And so it was just, that's how much energy it was taking to warm the pack as well as drive. We were also joking that maybe she had a little bit of a lead foot.
Yeah.
Yeah, but because it warms the car so fast and you see the temperature get to where you want it to be in say like 10 minutes, people naturally think, well, that's how long you should preheat the car for. So 10 minutes before I leave, go ahead and kick on the preheat. Which is great and all, but if you really, if you need the extra miles, if you need to be able to get, a good distance, then you want to start the preheat like an hour before you leave so that it's heating the battery.
So long as you're plugged in and you're pulling power
Yeah,
there.
well,
Otherwise, it really doesn't make a difference.
It doesn't make much of a difference now
Yeah.
if you're not plugged in. So there's something in the chat. Okay, so let me go. I didn't see there was some chat. How do you access the trip consumption screen? Well, if you have a Model S, a Model X, a Model 3, or a Model Y, not the new Model S. The new Model S doesn't have that screen. I'm hoping they put it in it. It should be, it's a little like a jagged line, an energy graph looking thing. Let me see if it's on the bottom bar down there. See if I have a picture of it.
Yeah, it's like the second or third icon, the energy icon on the bottom bar.
Oh, because you have to hit the caret, the pointy up thing next to the left seat heater to get to it. I don't have a screenshot or a picture of it with it up. Now, because once you, let me see if I can just find one on the web. But while I'm doing that, what were the other questions? It was, oh, how do you preheat the battery before a trip? You just turn on the cabin heat, which is just so if you just hit this little button right here in the app, that turns on the cabin preconditioning, which is the cabin heat, and it shows white once it's on. And that heats up the cabin, but at the same time, it's heating the battery. So while you see the little battery heater icon up here is heating the battery, and that can take 45 minutes or so to heat up all the way to the point that the car is optimized for driving. So I always think when it's cold out, when it's below freezing out, especially, to hit the preheat button an hour before you're ready to go to get the car to the optimal level.
Does the car give you an indication that the battery is preheated to a reasonable level, or?
The bacon strips disappear in the app.
Okay.
And also they have the charge line. Now it's, instead of being a separate screen, it's the charge line goes from green to this orange color while it's heating, and then back to green again when it's done heating.
Okay.
So when you start heating, it changes orange, and it adds these little bacon strips up here showing, the heat icon. And when it's done heating the battery, those disappear, and the line changes back to green.
Yeah, you can also do it by going into the climate menu where it shows the blow up of the car and
Yeah.
and hitting the on-off button there.
Well, yeah, you can hit the on-off button there.
That's
But
usually
this
where I've
this
been
menu
going.
over here.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But and this used to be where it would show the battery heating. It would show it up in the top right corner,
Yeah.
and it doesn't show it there anymore. Now
Okay.
now it shows it on the main screen. It shows it up on the main screen. So they
Hmm.
moved that around.
That's probably why I haven't seen it, because I've been going to that climate screen and, turning on my seat heater and my steering wheel
Mhm.
and then I'm done. So I haven't paid attention to the main screen. I have to go back there next time.
A question, is it better to use the departure time or to get up and turn the fan on?
I don't think it really matters. I mean,
Well,
if
the
you,
departure time, it would calculate it, wouldn't it?
well, yeah. I mean, it should heat the battery up so that it would be ready when you depart. Yes.
And your battery would be fully charged at that point also.
Oh, the departure. Okay.
So long as
long
you're
as
plugged in, yes.
So actually, I don't know. And maybe someone else knows. The departure time, that is just for charging the battery, or is that also preconditioning the car from a heating standpoint?
I think if you have the scheduled departure on and you have preheat turned on, it's actually in I was just looking at it, then I think it'll preheat for that scheduled departure is what I would assume when you go into yeah. So if you go, if you're in the app and you go to schedule and have it set to departure, there's a toggle where you could turn on precondition. And so it'll try to charge the car if you have fast enough charger, and I would assume precondition it for that time that you have set for departure.
Yeah, I mean, it says right here, you set the departure time, and then under precondition, if you turn that on, it says set climate and preheat battery.
Yep.
It says
Okay.
that right in the app.
If the battery is preheated, will it then, if you go to a supercharger, charge at the,
It's preheated enough to operate efficiently for driving and regen,
mhm,
but it's not preheated enough to use at a supercharger.
okay,
I mean, it will work at a supercharger. It'll still start out at a reduced rate while it's heating the battery more. So the combination of the energy from the supercharger going in and the car heating the battery in addition to that will ramp up the rate. Because I
Okay.
know the car does heat the battery even more when you're going to a supercharger. Because if you put the destination that you're in the nav as the supercharger, a message pops up that says preheating battery for supercharger. And
Mhm.
you can hear the car. You can hear that heat pump just kicking off in the car to heat that battery. It gets pretty aggressive about it. So a warm or a significantly warm battery is very good for supercharging.
Yeah, that is really key to make sure that if you're going to a supercharger, that you've selected the supercharger either directly by, clicking on that as the destination, or it's, in line as as your next stop on a longer trip, because that'll trigger it to supercharge or to heat.
So to the question of where the trip screen was, if you hit this little guy down here, it pops up a sub menu, and on there is an energy graph. And it looks kind of like this. So you just hit the energy graph, and there's two tabs, trip and consumption. Consumption isn't that useful, but trip is really, really useful. So you touch these up here and it switches between two different screens. So if it's not already selected, you touch the trip screen, the trip tab up here, and you get this display, which sometimes I just leave it up while I'm driving. If I have because I like to go down into single percentages. If I have a trip that's going to be close, so I could just constantly be glancing over and look at, how am I doing? Am I using too much or too little power? And the percent that you're going to get to here down at the bottom, that same percent is what's on the navigation screen, where it shows what your destination, what percent you'll be at the destination. And that changes as you drive as well. But this screen gives you a visual representation, so it's kind of neat.
Well, I learned something because I've seen the energy screen. I didn't realize there was that other button was there as a tab. So,
Yeah, it only works when you have navigation enabled. So if you have a destination enabled and navigation is running, then you can touch the trip tab up
Okay.
there, and it comes up with that message. If you don't have navigation, it doesn't do anything.
Okay.
So the trip is reset after each stop at a supercharger, correct?
Yes. So it's
Okay.
only going to show you until your next stop, whether that's the destination or a supercharger,
All right, thanks.
because it's all about getting to your next stop.
I think you mentioned this at the beginning, and forgive me for asking again. What are we expecting hit to range? Like if you say you had your car in the garage all night, you left with it preconditioned, it's ready to rock and roll with a 90% charge. Is it going to take a dramatic hit if it's, let's say, the average temperature for the day that you're driving is 30 to 40 degrees?
I mean, it will take a hit. It's just a matter of, and I think it's going to be different from model to model.
Mhm.
What exactly that percentage is, whether it's like 10% or 15% or 20% in that particular scenario, it's there may be people that have calculated it out there. I don't know.
Okay.
But the car actually would know. So if you know normally, you're going from this point to this point, and in navigation, it's going to show that you're going to have 35% battery when you get to that point B. If you go out there and 20% or 20-degree weather, and I would suggest going and start driving, give it 5 minutes before you hit navigation, so it gives you an accurate estimate, because it lets the sensor adjust to the outside temperature. It taking into account the outside air temperature, the current state of the battery, the current temperature of the battery, and the elevation changes on the route, which those don't really change, but the temperature does. So it's going to recalculate and come up with a different percentage of what it's going to be when you get there. And that percentage should be very accurate. It's just that it doesn't have any way of knowing how long you're going to be sitting at that destination, so it wouldn't know how to calculate the round trip properly.
Gotcha. But I shouldn't be expecting a 50% reduction in battery range, or would that?
No, to get 50% reduction in battery range, you'd have to do things like I was saying at the very beginning, where leave the house with a cold battery, you didn't do any preconditioning or anything. Leave the house with a cold battery, drive 30 minutes somewhere, 45 minutes somewhere, stop for 2 or 3 hours, get in the car, drive again for 45 minutes and stop for 2 or 3 hours, and drive again and stop for 2 or 3 hours. Because every time you stop, all the heat that's built up in the battery goes away. But not all of it, but a lot of it. And it has to use a lot more power to put heat back into the battery every time you get in the car and drive it. So there's scenarios where you're just going from point A, you're going to multiple different places during the day and you're leaving the car sit for hours and hours at a time at each place. That really drains the most energy out of the battery.
Okay, but in a road trip scenario where you're just jaunting from
Yeah.
supercharger to supercharger.
It's not as bad. No, nowhere near as bad.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's-
there's still some hit, yes, but
Sure.
it's not as bad.
Okay.
Michael, you were gonna say something?
Yeah, I was going to say exactly what you just said. Is that I mean it's a nominal hit. I mean I would say 5%, maybe 10%, because it's one of those things. Also, you don't think of wind chill, but wind affects the car's regardless of temperature. That seems to affect them more at the colder temperature if you're leaving the car standing. Not when you're driving. Wind speed, doesn't matter on temperature when the car's driving. But if it's standing, if there's no wind whatsoever, your car pack will cool off slower than if there's an ambient breeze blowing around the car, because you're blowing away that heat. You're blowing away any kind of buffer that you've got around the car.
All right, who else has a question or a comment?
I was
What
just
did I
gonna say,
miss?
hopefully the new feature in the latest software update where you can have the multiple destinations, that should make a road trip like this a little easier. And I'm assuming that'll help with the preconditioning too, where if you plug in, 4 superchargers as waypoints now, it'll do that hopefully all automatically.
Well, I mean, it would have had superchargers in automatically before, but
True.
now that's a good question. With the waypoints, can you manually select the superchargers then? Because that would be pretty cool. Because it
Yeah, that's what I'm
chooses
hoping to do.
superchargers that make no sense sometimes.
Yeah.
So I just override and go directly to. I just do a point-to-point navigation to the supercharger that I want to go to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that frustrates my wife to no end, because we just did a trip to Nashville, or from here to South Carolina, to Nashville to South Carolina, then back to here, and I will constantly be canceling the trip and selecting different superchargers, because of a variety of reasons. Sometimes selecting yourself into a V3 supercharger to get in and out faster, sometimes just to avoid certain bad ones, and it annoys her to no end whenever I'm doing that. But explaining at length on why it's better at times to also leapfrog to more superchargers and spend less time at them, and to be rolling in, like you were saying, Zeb, rolling in at single-digit percentages, from an efficiency perspective and time spent at a supercharging charger perspective. It's always more efficient if you're coming in at as low as possible.
Yeah, in all the traveling I do, I usually charge about 75%. Try not to charge more than that, or just charge enough to get to next supercharger that makes sense, and roll in there with 2%, 3% battery. The most efficient way of driving, but most people don't want to do that.
Yeah, if I'm sitting at a supercharger and I'm only getting like 40 or 50 kilowatts into the pack, it's time to move on, because you're going to be better off, leapfrogging to the next one and being able to pull in 100 or 120 kilowatts into the pack.
Someone's going back to the chat. Go ahead. What was that?
Is there a difference for a standard range Model 3 of going to a supercharger that does 150 versus 250 kilowatt?
I don't know. I mean, a standard range Model 3 may not be able to charge at the high rates as high as a long range Model 3, just because the pack is smaller.
Yeah,
I
that's
don't know
I was
what the difference
wondering.
is.
Well, and there's always the risk on a V2 supercharger that you're gonna end up pairing up with somebody else and getting half the charge speed.
So there was a
Is that what the
question.
150s are?
Yeah,
And the V3s are, you don't have that split between.
Well, it is, they're quads. There's four per stack, but the stack is really, really big. So you shouldn't have any problem getting a really high charge rate. So I don't know how big the actual charging stack is that's shared across four, but yeah, whenever I plugged into one, even with other people next to me, I always get up in the high 200 or above 200 initially when the battery is very low. So there's a question about what happens if the battery runs all the way down to zero in freezing weather. Well, the car won't go anymore. But there's actually, people have done that. And when they get towed to a supercharger and they plug in the supercharger, the car will just generally sit there for a good 20, 30 minutes and not charge because it has to heat the battery to the point that it can start taking charge. So nothing bad happens. It's the same as running it down to zero in warm weather. But it just takes longer to charge it when you do get it to a supercharger.
you should amend that. You know, actually running the battery to zero is not good for the battery, regardless of temperature. I mean, it doesn't actually take it to 0, 0. I mean, there is a reserve that's kept in there because those batteries do not like actually going to complete discharge. That will do actual physical damage to the battery.
Going to that question about standard range as opposed to long range, I thought standard range for home was limited to 32 amps and could not take any higher. That's
right. The onboard charger in the standard range or standard range plus is limited to 32 amps. That's irrelevant to superchargers because superchargers don't use the onboard charger. They connect directly to the battery.
Okay.
I don't know how, what the rates are on superchargers for standard range plus, but you're right. The limit for the internal charger, which is what is used when you plug into a regular wall connector or public charger, is limited to 32, where the other ones are 48.
Question. Is it better to use the seat heaters or the engine or the normal cabin heater if you're traveling? Which one's going to use a lead battery?
If you've gotten into the car, you stay at a hotel, it's been cold all night, and you get in the car and you're going to drive somewhere. I mean, if you want to use less power, then you just use the seat heaters and whether or not you have the steering wheel heater. But if you've preconditioned the car, then it's already going to be warm. So I guess technically, if you wanted to save the most power, you'd precondition the car so the cabin is nice and warm, the battery is warmed up, and then when you leave, you could turn off the heat and just use the seat heaters. That's going to use just a fraction of the power. So instead of maintaining the temperature of the entire cabin, you're just warming the seat. I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but I would guess it's somewhere in the neighborhood of less than 10% of the power that the cabin heater would use.
I'll chime in as someone who's driven lots of low range EVs. The one problem you'll have with that strategy is your windows will fog up. So
this is true. I had a
not only
Nissan
is it uncomfortable, but your windows all fog up. So it's
I remember the days of my Nissan Leaf in the dead of winter and having to cycle the defroster on and off because I couldn't turn the heat on in the car because it didn't have enough range. I wouldn't have gotten there. I actually had a little 12-volt electric blanket in the car that was just warm enough that I could wrap it around my legs. And I don't know how safe it was for driving, but because I mean, the seat heat's great. It kept my torso and most of my body warm, but my feet and my legs would get so cold driving that car in the winter. It was a good little car.
How long have you been driving electric car?
Since 2011. I got a Nissan Leaf in 2011.
Yeah, same here. I started the same way. November. It's been 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, with the Nissan Leaf, it was the low battery warning and the very low battery warning were just parts of my commute.
Yeah, I used to
Every day.
experience the same thing.
So anything else? Is there anything? I
Thank you
forgot?
very much. Been very informative.
Yep.
Thanks very much, Zeb.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Hey, Zeb, you mentioned that the new Model S's, they've changed the display, so it's not showing.
Right now, the new Model S does not have the consumption and trip energy graph. And a lot of people are not terribly thrilled about that, me included,
Yeah.
because I'm getting a new Model S and I'd like to have that graph. I really like it. So hopefully that's just something that they haven't added into the new UI yet, and they will be added later, but we don't know. Or maybe they'll replace it with something more interesting that gives you more information. That would be cool, but we don't know.
I would have thought most of the UI elements for the new Model S would be similar to the 3 and the Y. So I'm kind of surprised that they don't have it.
It is a bit different than the 3 and the Y. I mean, it's got, the 3 and the Y are very static. It has a lot of ability to move things around, put different icons on your tray type things, slide screens around. It's neat, but it's not polished. And hopefully the part of the not polished is not having yet gotten the trip screen in there.
Hey, Zeb, I'll have a quick question since I know you also have an old Model S like me. The preconditioning battery routing to a supercharger does that happen on old S's? Because I just haven't observed it, but I don't know for sure if it does.
It happens on most old S's. It doesn't happen on mine.
Oh, okay. Well, that's
no, the
interesting.
reason it doesn't happen is because I don't have navigation. So I can't navigate to a supercharger. So there's no way to there's no way to turn on preconditioning for the supercharger without having navigation. So
you have one without the tech package?
Correct.
Wow.
It's crazy. It's crazy. I love that car so much. I upgraded to MCU2 and
you still don't get navigation.
I still don't get
MCU2?
navigation. But
seems
it's funny because I
horrible.
can go in there and it says I have a map update and it downloads new maps for navigation that is disabled.
In theory, I'm getting my MCU2 upgrade on Friday. I've been waiting for like almost 2 months because the parts have been back ordered that long. So.
Yeah, well, my MCU1 failed and the car just sat in the garage for about 2-3 months and didn't move because I was just waiting for MCU2. I didn't want to, because at the time it was very costly to replace MCU1 with another MCU1. So it's like, I'll just pay an extra $1,000 and get MCU2 when it's ready and just let the car sit there.
Yeah, my 2016 Model S both of them will do the preconditioning going to a supercharger. Yours is what, about 2 years older, Zeb?
Yep, it's early 2014, so it's first generation before they introduced autopilot and later in 2014.
But does it actually say it on the screen? Does it note it's preconditioning? Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
if you're looking at, because you have to have navigation up at the very top of the list of directions of the navigation, it'll insert like a little blob of text that says, en route to, or preconditioning, battery pack for supercharging.
All right, cool, excellent, thank you.
I don't know how strong the preconditioning is on different cars. I'm going to guess that the Model 3s that are prior to the 2021 Model 3, it's not as strong as the new Model 3s when it comes to the supercharger preconditioning, because I know they did a lot of work getting the heat pump to be able to push heat into the battery pack on the Model Y and the new Model 3. And the previous Model 3s, they were doing something with running the coolant through the motor and using the motors, running the motor inefficiently or something to generate heat. I don't know exactly what they were doing, but they didn't have a dedicated battery heater. So it may take longer in most Model 3s for it to precondition.
Just as a data point for real world, I mean, when I was in Nashville this last week, the temperatures were nominally freezing to maybe about 40 degrees, and I was routinely leaving either my hotel or friend's house, and it was about a 20-minute drive to the supercharger, and I would go straight to the supercharger if I needed to. And by the time I hit the supercharger, that it had preconditioned the battery in 20-minute drive to the point where on a dedicated V3 supercharger, it would only let me pull about 70 kilowatts.
Oh, okay.
Where normally I would be able to pull, 100, 110 in similar, warm battery conditions. So it's better than nothing. I mean, you're not coming in with an ice cold pack and trickle charging initially.
Yeah, because I mean, if you're coming in with a cold pack, you're looking at like 10 kilowatt for the first 15
exactly.
minutes or so. Yeah.
So it did a reasonably good job. And if it was a little bit farther away, it probably would have been more ideal. But it's not the kind of thing that you can do with a 5-minute drive to a supercharger. Like if you're pulling out of a hotel and you've got a 5-minute drive and you think it's going to precondition that 5 minutes, it's not going to really do it in that distance.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's no way from the app to say, I'm driving 5 minutes down the road to a supercharger in an hour. Can you please precondition this for me?
Exactly.
But if you go down to the car, and I was playing around with this just to see what would happen. If you go down to the car and sit in the car and just turn navigation onto the supercharger, it starts preconditioning for the supercharger. I wonder if you could do that while you're plugged in.
Well, I wonder if you send, how you can send directions to your car from your app. I wonder if you sent the destination for the supercharger, if that would trigger the same response path.
I significantly doubt it, but I'm absolutely going to try that. Because that would be a really cool trick to do. I mean, even if not, if you had the ability to go down and sit in the car, so you turn it on and navigate. When I got out of the car and closed the door, and the car locked, it stopped preconditioning for the supercharger. I did test that, but I don't know, maybe get a little crazy and want to.
Yeah,
it sounds like a feature they could add. That's for sure.
It sounds a little bit like if you just, if you're going to leave at a certain time, just set the destination time. Set the departure time rather, and from the app, and then you don't have to go to the car, and you can set it.
Well, no, it'll still heat the battery up. It just won't get the battery hot. It just warms the battery enough for driving. I'm talking about it does a secondary process on the battery where it pushes as much heat into as it can, or up to a certain point for a supercharger. It gets the battery extra warm for a supercharger. So it can take that really high current in. So even if your battery is fine, you're driving down the interstate, everything's warmed up. When you put in navigation for a supercharger, if it's the least bit cool out, it's still going to be hitting some extra heat into that battery. So if there's a way to do that while the car was, way to do that remotely, saying, I'm in a hotel room, the supercharger is 5 minutes down the road. I want to go ahead and let you go crazy and heat the battery up as hot as you can get it for that supercharger. That would be really cool. But as far as I know, there's no way to do that remotely.
Yeah, it's times like these that
sitting in the car, you can sit in the car and have it do that. But
why can't you do that with the precondition?
Well, you would do that's what I was saying. You would do the precondition.
Scheduling.
Precondition the scheduling, or using the app to just remotely turn on the heat. And that will warm the battery up a certain amount. It doesn't prepare it for supercharging, it prepares it for driving. So I don't know what the numbers are. Say it warms it up to 40 degrees or something like that, so it's ready for driving. Well, when you route to a supercharger, it wants to warm it up to 70 degrees so that it can take the full current of the supercharger.
I got you.
And there's no way to do that remotely. That's only done through navigation.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it's times like these that you wish that they didn't try to build too much smarts into the UI where it's trying to, read your mind, and you just had a toggle that you could just say, precondition for supercharging. You're like, I know better than you do what I want the car to do. But unfortunately they don't do that.
Yeah, but I mean, doing the regular preconditioning will also help significantly with the supercharger.
Yes.
Because that example I gave where I went to the supercharger and could barely get 10 kilowatt for quite a while it was warming up the battery. I didn't do any preconditioning at all. I did nothing. It was earlier in the days of Tesla, and I just didn't think about it. And it was very, very cold. Just got in the car, the supercharger's right here. Just drive across the street and plug in. And did nothing and paid the price for it. It had to sit there for, I want to say it was close to 2 hours. No, it wasn't 2 hours, like an hour and 45 minutes to charge the car up enough to get down the road to where I was going, which was Hickory, I believe.
So I guess one more only the old cars have range mode, right? The 3s and Ys and stuff don't have range mode. Is that
No, they don't have range
interesting?
mode, but a lot of
Okay.
people that tested range mode found that it really didn't do very much.
Yeah, I don't ever use it, but just curious.
I've never used it.
It does turn off the battery heating, if I understand correct, at least while you're driving or something like that, right?
Oh, I didn't know that. I
Yeah,
thought
that was one
it
of-
limited power to HVAC, and I didn't know what else it did.
Yeah, that's one of the, sorry, I'm like a Tesla Bjorn fanboy, so I have to go with too many of the stuff, but yeah, range mode, in the old cars, it would turn off the battery heater and because that was, it was literally like, let's put all power into driving. So anyway.
So there's a question, does the preconditioning stop if you tap the preconditioning message on the navigation and the message disappears? I think it does, but then it comes back on like 5 minutes later. Or does
Yeah, I
anybody
think-
else know? I
I
know I've
wasn't
tapped
sure.
it and the
Yeah.
message, and it just went away. And the message came back up like just 5 minutes later, the message popped back up.
Yeah, same
So I'm-
here. I was wondering what it was about, what it was doing.
Yeah, there's only been one instance where I needed, or I wanted preconditioning to not run, not preconditioning, but the supercharger charging, that little message popping up. I wanted to turn it off, and I was taking kids back from a trip, and as I had originally routed in to go through a supercharger, but I was realizing that I can get home with like 2%. It's fine. So I canceled out of that and just did a direct route home. So it wasn't using the extra energy to heat the battery up for supercharging. But then one of the children needed to use the restroom. Then that was the most convenient thing, was the sheets that was coming up. So I just tapped the supercharger again, and then it popped and starts preconditioning the battery for supercharging. No, I don't want to do that. So I just canceled it out and just drove directly there, because I didn't want to use the extra power because I wasn't stopping to supercharge.
Thank you.
But yeah, I'm not sure, to answer your question. I'm not sure if it turns it off or not. I do know that that little message will pop up and go away sometimes, because I've had it where I'm going to a supercharger, it comes up and it says conditioning battery for supercharging, and you can hear the car, you can hear the heat pump whining, because it really kicks it up a notch when it does that. And then 5 minutes later, the message disappears and you can hear it spin down. And then maybe 15 minutes later, it spins back up and starts going again. So I don't know if it was that it warmed battery up enough, and then driving, it started to cool down again, so it decided to warm it up some more. Or if it was some sort of a process where it did it twice, not sure.
Thank you.
So is there anything else?
I've actually got 3, but they might be topics for later discussion.
Well, I mean, we're at the
One-
end, so why not?
Yeah. One is that safety beta piece of crap. The one you use for the full self-drive and all those phantoms. I don't know if you've experienced them or not.
Well, I've experienced phantom braking, sure. Less
Yeah,
so
yeah.
on the interstate. It's more of just driving around town, but yes.
Yeah, driving around town during rush hour, it doesn't work at all. That was one. Another one is there any way to try to calculate how many miles you can get per 10% of battery. Like, for example, we always talk about 80% charge, go down to 20%. How many miles do you get in that? You know, it's car dependent, but it's just a curiosity point. You know, like my Model Y long range, they claim 326 miles, but you know, it's nowhere near that. You know,
Well,
so
how many real world miles, or how many
yeah,
the estimated miles?
no, real world.
It would vary greatly with the driving conditions. And that's where the
Oh, I understand that.
yeah, that's where, like, this in this chart, this goes back to that energy graph. You can see it in the energy graph, both the miles and the percents. So if you had the energy graph up and you plotted a course and you just pull up the energy graph, you don't even have to be moving. Where is it? You just automatically turn that back on. So, I mean, you have the percentages, but you also have the miles down here. So you'll see that you're going to go from 73 to 4%. So in this trip, you're going to travel 100 and whatever miles. It's a little more than 150, and use this percent of the battery. I mean, you can, it doesn't give you this is how much 10% uses, but with some simple math, you can figure that out pretty easily.
You know, well, they always give you like the EPA estimate, which is
yeah, well, this is not
to zero, which is absolutely useless.
Yeah, this is real world based on elevation changes on your route and the current temperature outside, the air temperature outside. It doesn't have the intelligence to figure out, you know, things like wind speed and whether or not it's raining. Someday it will probably, but it does do the basics of elevation and temperature. So this is usually extremely accurate. I've been on many trips where I've driven 75 miles an hour on the interstate, and I'll leave at a certain percentage and I'll get there spot on right where it was estimating I would get.
Is that thing accurate? Like, you know, halfway down, look, how many miles have you got left?
Well, that's where's the
Yeah, I actually
that
find
was so great about
more
it
often than not,
is
it's a little conservative. I mean,
it can be conservative. I don't like telling people it's conservative because then yeah,
true.
that's what
but-
I'm saying. Where
I mean, usually my colored line is a hair is like that. It's a hair better than it's estimated. Sometimes that hair can be 5 to 10, 10% battery capacity over 150 mile range.
yes, I almost always and I'm driving 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. You know, I'm not driving conservatively at all, but I almost always come in just above where it estimated. So the gray line is when you plug in nav, it creates the gray line. And then the colored line sits on top of it. And then when you start driving, as you're driving, it's constantly taking readings and figuring out what the percentage of the car is, the percent here, and it's plotting them on the graph, and it's estimating out the rest of the trip based on the previous plots. So it's constantly updating this line and drawing it farther and farther out, depending on how you're driving and what the conditions are. Now, if you have a really, really strong headwind and it's raining like hell and you're driving 85 miles an hour, you're going to get the colored line. It's going to be slightly below here, below your estimated line. But if you're driving reasonable, and this is much more real world, you will likely have it either directly on the line or slightly above it. So that percent estimate that it says that shows that you're going to get to your destination at is a very accurate estimation. The only caveat to that is it can be thrown off if you start navigation in a warm environment and then drive out of the garage into the frigid cold, because it's calculating originally based on that warm environment. Because then you'd see, as you start driving, you'd see this line suddenly dip down and start going below the other line.
Yeah, the one thing I wish they'd add to that were how many miles to the nearest supercharger. With gas stations, you don't worry about that because you got a gas station everywhere, but we don't have superchargers everywhere.
Well, the navigation should automatically be sending you to
now you're bouncing between two screens.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But if you're already navigating to a supercharger, that is how far it is to the supercharger.
The one annoying thing is it won't recalculate your superchargers. At least I've never had it recalculate superchargers. If you're falling below that line, if you're over consuming, and there's a closer supercharger than the one it picked, it will put up the slow down warning and get you to reduce yourself to a crawl long before it would do anything to reroute you to the closer supercharger.
Yeah, so I mean that is a great point in that it's something that you'd want to do if you ever get that slow down message and you start feeling uncomfortable about it. Just hit cancel and then hit navigate again, and just whatever you were navigating to is just right there on the history. That forces it to recalculate.
Okay. Yeah, it seems to be overly complex. I'm just waiting for the day we got a supercharger on every corner. Like we do gas stations. I'm trying to correlate it to gas stations.
Yeah, well, for traveling, we have enough superchargers now for traveling. We just don't have enough saturating every part of the state or part of the everything, so that, like you said, it would be on every corner. So if you went and you drove somewhere and you were spending a week in a particular location, you wouldn't have to drive to the other side of town or maybe the next town to get to the supercharger.
Correct.
Yeah.
I'm usually pretty careful about picking hotels that have destination chargers and being able to make use of those. This last trip, I chose poorly in terms of where the hotel was and the folks that we were visiting. And so I had to do a lot. I had to stop at the supercharger almost daily to top myself back up, because in between preheating and even just going, what amounted to a 30-minute drive, it just chewed through battery like it was nothing in those cold temperatures.
Yep. Because it sat there and got real cold.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing. If you're a little more careful about picking, where you're staying, that can make a world of difference to the quality of the trip or the amount of time you spent twiddling thumbs at superchargers.
And I'm also going to drop a link in the chat to a website called PlugShare. If you haven't used that already, it makes route planning really nice. Seeing all the superchargers, Tesla does a nice job putting the superchargers on a map, but this one you can, plan a route and add superchargers along. And if you are like me and like to plan ahead.
There is a PlugShare or a supercharger app also. I just wish it would show the future ones.
Let me show you something with PlugShare real quick. That's a feature most people don't know was there. That's really handy for picking a hotel. So if you're going somewhere, I don't know, let's just say we're going over here, and I want to stay at a hotel that has charging. Instead of clicking on each one of these and seeing which one of them's at or near a hotel, you can go into the little bar over here, scroll down, and do hotel lodging for filters. And it shows only the ones that are at or near a hotel. It's smart enough to know that it's within walking distance of a hotel, so it'll show ones that are close to it. Like the supercharger is close enough to a hotel that means it was, if you look down there and you could find a hotel. And this one is actually at the Hampton Inn. But being able to filter out all the noise and just seeing things that are at hotels makes it really handy. There's quite a lot of them in Charlotte.